started. Right. This next session is called Armor Up. We'll hear a little bit more from our keynote speaker, Jay Fuhrer. The keynote presentation earlier was brought to us by one of our sponsors, NRCS. And this session is being made possible by generous support of Petenwell and Castle Rock Stewards. You can find out more about our sponsors and other conference information in the conference hub on our website. For those of you who did not attend Jay Fuhrer's keynote, he is a soil health specialist who has worked with NRCS in Bismarck, North Dakota from 1980 to 2020. His experience over the last 38 years working with cropping systems, grazing systems, cover crops, and gardens. Jay also has extensive background working with groups and entities such as soil and water conservation districts, national and international no-till organizations, watersheds, farm organizations, urban groups, and more. More recently, Jay spends his time at the Minokan farm, minimizing soil disturbance, adding soil armor, as he'll tell us about, maximizing plant diversity, maintaining living roots in the soil, and integrating livestock. Thank you for being here today, Jay. You can take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I can see it great, and I can hear you just fine.
Okay, wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about taking some of the principles and converting that to a practice. And something I've always appreciated about soil health principles is that they are a principle. And that means there's lots of different ways to apply them. And what works in one farm is not going to necessarily work in another farm, but you find your way. And so if you think in terms of the old term best management practices, for instance, you can find a number of these underneath each principle. And so the principles were intended to be a starting point, and they were also intended to be put on the soil, if you will, as a suite of practices. And so let's take one, and we're going to call it Armor Up. And so we've had 2 years of drought here, and this past summer, triple-digit heat and virtually no rainfall meant most of our corn crop was cut for silage by the end of July. It normally would be harvested for grain, but it was cut for silage and stockpiled at the end of the field. And so that puts us in kind of a precarious position. We're very concerned about our spring, because typically in the northern Great Plains, you're going to get some balmy days in the spring with 40, 50 mile an hour winds. It might blow for one day, or it might decide to blow for 3-4 days. And so that is a concern, and something that I think we constantly work at. So let's go ahead and talk about this a bit more. And so the principles, we're just going to take soil armor. I like to start with soil armor because until you stabilize that field, it's difficult to go further. And I think that's a huge difference, and there's different ways to do this. And so we're going to walk through a few different options. I gave a talk a year ago or so for Wisconsin, and I went back and looked at my old presentation and tried to get in different examples, etc. So if I had something I used a year ago, I'm trying not to use it too much today. So it's pretty much all different data and examples, more importantly. So something that we need to think about, first of all, is water. And so if you look at this cucumber leaf, that's guttation water, okay? So guttation water happens when the stomata closes, when there's no sunlight. The stomata is going to close, so it happens at night. And if it's a pressure pushing water up the xylem, and it comes out the hydathodes right here on the edge of the leaf, okay? And so when we think about that, that's one of the principal sources of water for the insect world. And so they're very good at using guttation water. And so this is early morning. This is not dew. And if I water this frame in the high tunnel too much, you're going to find more. If it's too dry, you probably won't hardly find any the next morning. So it all has to do with water, but this is water that the plant is using. This is serving a function for the insect world. And then transpiration, we're familiar with this. Transpiration is going to be through the stomata. And as CO2 comes into the plant, water vapor comes out. And so we have transpiration. And then evaporation is a real issue in the northern plains. Evaporation, first of all, it doesn't go through a plant, so it's not building soil aggregates, it's not putting carbon exudates in the soil, it's not doing any of these functions. In our environment, it leaves a little salt behind. And so this is not an issue for a year or two or maybe even 50 years. But now we've been farming in the Dakotas roughly 130 years, somewhere's in there. And so now it is an issue, and so it's a big impact on crop production in the Dakotas. So we keep these in mind. The other comment I want to make about guttation water, since it does feed a lot of the insect world, is if you use fungicide or insecticide, something like that, that is water soluble and systemic, that's going to end up in this water as well. So it's just something that you kind of want to weigh out there. Evergreen plants a carbon inlet. This is a full season cover crop for managed grazing at the Minokan farm. And I love walking through it. And so you can see my red hoop here. So I go ahead and clip some frames so I get some idea on production. And but there's about 12 species in there, and they all play a role. So when you clip those species, you clip them off just above the soil. You lay them across your hand, and balance it. And you cut it in half then. Okay, so now you have it in half by weight, not height, but by weight. And then you send them in to see what you have in terms of relative feed value, total digestible nutrients, crude protein, etc. Where is most of the crude protein? Where's most of the energy? It's going to be in the top half of the plant. And so we always try to graze the top half. You can graze further, but now you're going to take from the armor of the soil, and you are also putting your critters on a little lower plane of nutrition. And so depending on if it's getting closer to breeding season and there's some concerns on conception rates, there's lots of things you can do to help that. But the top half is definitely where you want the animals grazing, the top half by weight. And so most of the weight's in a little bit further down on the plant. And so you are taking a fair bit of the material, but there's still half by weight remaining, which we'd like to get trampled to the soil surface. So wildlife aspects as well. And so the 60-inch corn I've kind of liked because of the sunlight it allows in. And when you walk it, the diversity of animals that you find, everything from a pheasant nest on. And so there'll be trails in here as well. And so everything kind of finds some life in there. So I really, it's a little different than the conventional cornfield, just a little bit. So we combine open heifers and dry ewes. So the dry ewes come from North Dakota State University. We borrow them each summer. And the open heifers, the soil district purchases in the early summer and sells in the late fall. And they go together in a small pasture, and we feed them a little cake for 2-3 days so they get to know each other. Invariably, the first day, the heifers like to chase those dry ewes around the perimeter of the pen for a while. And they get tired of it, and they say, okay, let's just go eat this cake and everything's good. So there's an acclimation, and we get them used to each other. In this particular case, you can see they kind of crowd inside. Sometimes you'll find them go inside the yearling herd. And so they are very compatible together, and they show good promise. So this one, I'm just going to see if I can show you some life here. So, you know, everything from cowbirds to pheasants on, you can see them sitting here on top of the ewes yet, and they run some on top of the yearlings. And when you bring these, initially at the Minokan farm, there wasn't, you wouldn't find a bird when we started. But when we started getting flowering plants and we got the insect world, then the bird world came. And these things, you start to build that ecosystem. So, but armor is used to enhance the habitat and the life. You have to have that. And if it's green and alive, I like it even better. So this is our scale. So we weigh after every forage change, weigh the critters. We got a little bit of a bud box here, so they get inside. And then when they come in here, they swirl. This gets closed. They come in here and they swirl and go in. So it's a nice smooth transition. And when they come out of the other end after being weighed, they always get a treat. So they're just like me. They're pretty agreeable when they're being fed. So really, the Minokan farm for livestock integration, I'm going to use this example. If you had a cornfield and you combined it, and the dead litter is on the soil surface that fall, so where's the food supply for the biology? It's starting the decomposition path, okay? So it has to get into some of the decomposition so that the biology can have access to it. The saprophytic fungi will break it down into a smaller chain, and the bacteria will kind of come in and clean up. But if you have livestock and they come in, you can make food available that same day through the ruminant. And so that's such a game changer. And so when these critters come in, they really like these sunflower heads. And so they'll consume them. They'll go around, pick them off. If the deer haven't gotten those already, the yearlings will clean them off. And then, you know, we got some data. We grazed that 60-inch corn and covers. Average daily gain was 2.8. The best performing yearling, and these are open heifers, the best performing yearling was at 3.9. The lowest performing was at 1.3. And so we did this 7 times after 7 different forage changes. And I've often said, I think we have a value added chance here to sell replacement heifers as well, because this is the type information, if you could look at that at the end of the year, would help you decide which one might fit your environment. So, you know, it's good data, really helps you formulate. The cover crops alone were about 3,400 pounds approximately, okay? And so it kind of tells you what the scenario was. There was no rain. It still produced 40 bushels of corn. It was the only cornfield standing. Everything else had been chopped. So it was quite an island of life, if you will. Biennials, we also use them. This is a triticale vetch, clipped out over 10,000 pounds dry weight, so it was quite a mass of material. And we used sheep on this one, an electric ribbon and some step-in posts, which they respected the ribbon very well, at least until you went to move them. Once you go to move them, the signal was that ribbon is no longer an issue. So you had to be a little quick on the move. But it was 70 pounds of triticale in our environment, 20 pounds of vetch. They grazed it from mid-June to the beginning of August. So we had a nice run on it, pretty high nutrition as well. So we had 90 dry ewes, and they got about 1/5 of an acre a day. And when you're grazing 12 acres, that's a lot of moves with a lot of ewes. And so it was a lot of material, but it definitely has potential to become armor. So you can tell where we were at on it, you know, with the gains, etc. So I think that spoke well of the system. And the sheep definitely had nice condition coming off of there. So 90 ewes, that was 417 grazing days per acre. So I can't tell you what a ewe grazing day is valued at. I can just tell you how many of them per acre. And you would have to supply the other portion of it as far as what the value is. So also, one day I couldn't find them, and they had gone into the soils pit. So finally, because when I drove by, I didn't see anything, and they weren't in the field, and a bunch of them had decided they were going to be soil scientists. And so then I went and started walking up to them, and they started kind of filing out of the soils pit. And then they gave me a little attitude here. If you watch at the end, all of a sudden, there it is. There they gave me the big stare. And so sheep they're kind of an interesting scenario. Also, one of the clients not too far from the farm where I've worked with a number of years on Blackleg Ranch, they added covers. And this is one of their earlier efforts in terms of adding diversity. And so what they were looking at was winter grazing. And this is what it would look like in the northern plains. And so it's definitely, it was interesting. So we did all the work on forage analysis. And if you take a look, I did 3 years worth right here. Gives you an idea on the crude protein, gives you an idea on the total digestible nutrient. And then you start hitting that, of course, against what the critter needs. And so what you're looking at is if they're in the first two trimesters, you're probably not even really needing a supplement. If you're in there in the 3rd trimester, that's different. Now your need has gone up. So when you get into the last trimester, the late pregnancy, and then of course after calving, now you have a greater need. But when they're in the first 6 weeks, or excuse me, first 6 months, they're probably going to do pretty well just on this cover crop mix. And so it kind of gives you an idea of where we've gone with that in terms of adding. And then this becomes a cornfield. So planting green into soybean and cereal rye. We've also done the pinto beans. This is springtime at the Minokan farm. And so when I have a green field like this is where I'm going to find all the worms. All the earthworms are in here. When you're over here on just a brown litter, not so much. You'll find some, but not nearly as many as here. There's a lot happening here with the exudates going into the soil. And then we bring the critters on, and that allows us to get a graze on it before it goes to soybean. So then you ask yourself, well, what's that worth? Well, if you look at the pounds of beef per acre, in this particular year, we took off just under 100 pounds of beef per acre. And that was on the cereal rye. Yeah. So gives you some idea. 100 pounds of beef per acre is a nice little shot in the arm. Gives you a place to go with them at a time of year when maybe other pastures or potential fields aren't ready yet. And then also average daily gains, they did quite well on that rye field as well. So they were something over 3, which is certainly one of the highest for us compared to all of the other locations that they went. So when you weigh them after each of these forage changes, that's when you really start to understand the higher performers or the not so high performers. You also understand when you even lost weight. And so all things you wouldn't know if you only knew the weight at the beginning and then the weight at the end. So you wouldn't know how they performed over these different forages. So then we end up, after it rebounds back, we get a little regrowth, and then we're going to go ahead and plant it to soybean or pinto bean. We've also done canola and flax. So basically broadleaves into a grass is work for us in our environment. And then, ultimately we want to harvest that. So this was 2020, first year of our drought. We managed through that one pretty well. As some of you know, the second year of the drought was a little tougher. Rotational perennials, we use those. They typically, we seed something to a perennial mixture, and it'll be then 4 years of managed grazing, 1 year of establishment, 4 years of managed grazing. These livestock talk, and so they're telling you about what they can do. Soil aggregates, water quality, salinity, carbon, all these things that we talk about that are not always easy to achieve. And I've monitored soils for a long time, and the whole carbon quest is a difficult one. And then also hanging on to it is difficult. Maintaining is difficult. So when we have the more tools like this we have in our toolbox, the better our chances are. So this was a particular mix that we had put in a few years ago. I like diversity, and it's Northern Plains. We can grow some grass for sure, and that's what we were as far as original landscape after the glaciers receded 10-12,000 years ago. And so we were grass for quite some time, and it still does well when we put it back into that scenario. This was 21 species. It's not your mix, it's one, yours would be different, but this one worked for us. And then when we move them, I want a good trample. So we want a small enough area so we get a good trample. And that particular day, then they're ready to move again with the bricks, maybe a little closer to noon. So the photosynthetic rate is ramped up a little bit more of what it's capable of. Then we have a higher sugar content, a little bit more nutritious grass. And because when you move them, they want to graze, right? So when they get in a new pasture, they're going to graze. So if you can hit that peak, I think that's helpful. This is what it looks like. I don't want to see the soil. So if we can get an armor on it, we're in pretty good shape then. So just, I'm not going to go through this in detail. The daily gain per heifer was 2.75 on this perennial, and the gain per acre was 145 pounds per acre on the first go through. So this is the first rotation, and then it gets a rest. Okay. Now this is the second rotation. So on the second rotation, you notice that the gain has gone up. Now it's at 3.4. This isn't uncommon, at least for us. Our first time through, the grass is a little higher moisture content, usually a little higher water. And second time through, it's just kind of the perfect balance. We get some regrowth, but it's not quite as much water in it. We usually get just a little bump on gain, normally, not always. And so the same pasture, then we added an additional 52 pounds. So if I'm going to go back one. So if you take the 145 and add the 52, now you're starting to get close to a couple hundred pounds of beef per acre. Then you ask yourself, what's that worth? And in today's world, at least in our neck of the woods here, we see more direct marketing. And there's been a pretty strong influence on that. And so direct marketing, that's a pretty good story that you can tell with your product. So what happened on the soils? Okay, so when we started, the pH was 5.8 and soil organic matter was 2.8. 5 years later, the pH is almost neutral. Okay, so the biology went to work, and they moved this thing a bit closer to neutral. And if you look at the base saturation, this is our starting base saturation right here. You can see the calcium is quite low, hydrogen is quite high. The closer you get to neutral on pH, this is going to look differently then. Okay, so, and then in the lower left-hand corner, these are kind of the so-called recommended ranges for each of these on base saturation. Okay, so what it did is it moved it into a little different scenario. Now we are looking at kind of more, a little closer to ideal, if you will. And so we definitely have a higher performing soil. Okay, that's with managed graze, that's with perennials. Annuals have a little more difficult time. They don't have the root mass that the perennials have. And typically you don't have the diversity that you can have in the perennials. Native rangeland, I'm within a few miles of some close by here. Native rangeland in this county is going to have normally over 100 species per acre. And so when you have that kind of environment, what I have here, what I show on the slide, is it 21 species? Somewhere's right in there. That's just kind of leaning into it a little bit. But our native rangeland would have over 100. So when we go ahead and graze, like we mentioned earlier, now we convert it to food for that day. Instead of that whole decomposition process, now we have it for that day. And you can see all of these little cavities in this cow patty here. So all these different cow pats, they come with the dung beetles, but then they're used for other critters after that. So the mites and the dung beetle typically come in together. You want mites riding on the dung beetle. The dung beetle is kind of like a big aircraft carrier or something like that. And the mites are along for the ride. And one goes after the manure and one goes after egg larvae. They're quite a combination. And then the cavity is used by other critters afterwards. So it's, again, it's all part of that system that's hard to replicate without livestock. So this is crop rotations with cover crops, and they've become essential for the future. And so you're looking at this particular picture. I've always kind of found kind of interesting because I remember this evening so well. We had folks on a trailer with the tractor, and we get to this cover crop field, and at the cover crop field I made a big mistake. And the mistake I made was I let them get off the trailer. And once they got off the trailer, they didn't want to get back on the trailer. And so they just enjoyed walking around, looking at the species. We had a frost already that fall. You can see, you know, the sunflower heads kind of had dried up already, and the petals were gone. And so as I recall, we already had a frost on this, but it was still just a beautiful stand. And so it was a whole scenario there where I think some good conversations happen. And so I always try to have a cover crop field at the Minokan farm. And the interesting thing about the cover crop field is this. I've seen folks take selfies. I've seen them lay down in it, but mostly I've seen them walk out into it and close their eyes. And then they listen, because there's so much life, they can hear it. You can hear the insects. And so it's kind of a different scenario. Things like we seem to have forgotten about a bit in production ag. You know, especially the first half of my career, I was going to, not just going to, I did kill everything. And then later you understand that, yeah, that's probably not going to get us there. And so we start going down a different road. And in order to do that, I think we have to get some appreciation for life and for all these things that we have. So I'm going to come back to this slide. I just want to touch on this one. I didn't know if I have enough time, but I do. So I want to touch on this. This is the Miller Ranch. Then we'll come back to the closing slide. This is the Miller Ranch south of Mandan, right across the Missouri River here from Bismarck. And this is them grazing. This was Ken Miller. He recently passed away last spring. And but he probably moved us forward on grazing. He was basically second to none in his grazing knowledge. But this is his herd on standing forage, and also winter. And so he did all those type things. But you can see the condition on them. You know, they look good, and you can see that they did well on this. And then he also was pretty good about, this is what he would leave. And so he taught us all a lot about taking part of this and not taking another part, and then how it got stronger in the future because you did that. And then also he was kind of a premier a bit in bale grazing in the Northern Plains. And so this was him setting up, this was a tame hayland field. And so he would set up the bales that he grew on that field, and then he would augment or supplement, add some, okay? And then he's ready for the winter feeding. So he didn't have to start a tractor. And this is our winter, and they did well. And so the whole carbon scenario, you're cycling it right back where you grew it. So many times our hayland fields don't stay in production long because the nature of it is we take that material off the field and it gets fed somewhere else. And so it's not evil to make a bale, but what we need to think about is where the bale is going to get fed. Because there is a lot of carbon and there's a lot of nutrient in that bale. And then this is how it would look. So the one on the right didn't have the bale grazing and the one on the left did. And so it changed the production, changed all those elements. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back here. And again, this is the reading list. And we're going to leave some time for Q&A. So this is the reading list. And I used to always make the comment after a presentation that when you get this list done, let me know, and I'll send you a second list, which I have. And some people would always kind of find that humorous. And but I can't tell you how many times it's happened to me in my career. I'd get an email and they'd say something like, send the second list. And so I would. And but again, like we talked about after the first talk, all good scenarios, try to find your local documents. Sometimes railroads did a lot of observations before a railroad went through. Sometimes if you can get those original documents, those are good. And sometimes it's journals that were kept by settlers in Wisconsin. And there's a wealth of information in all those to help us understand what it was. And when we understand that part, then we can understand a little better how to rebuild. So with that, I'm going to stop there and see if we would like to have a little bit more of a conversation, maybe just a little bit more than we had earlier today.
Thank you, Jay. We do have some questions in the chat box, and if anybody else has some thoughts, please feel free to type them now, and we'll try to get through them in the next 15 minutes.
Perfect.
So our first question here from Mitch in Sauk County. The fields that have perennial native species, after seeding, how long are you waiting before you graze?
Yeah, and so what we did is 1 year of establishment. And so the first time I did it was the mix that I showed you. The second time I adjusted the mix somewhat because some of these species for us are a little harder to get established, and we're only leaving them in 5 years. If you're leaving them in forever, that's a different story because you've got more time for the warm season natives to establish. But we gave them a 1 year establishment window. And so whereas I could find all the species after that, the native warm seasons were slower in establishment for sure. I mean, we knew this. And so that also influenced how we grazed it the first year. So the first year we come in a little later in the year and give it a little extra additional time on that second spring. So it's a good question.
Okay. Would you agree that improving soil health and regenerative ag is the most important undertaking to improving water quality in the ag community?
Well, there's an old saying that we don't always like. And the old saying is, water quality is a direct reflection of how we live on the land. And we don't always like that because I think we feel a little threatened by it maybe, but for sure. And so, the example I'm going to use to answer this question is the conversation that's going on right now about carbon, voluntary carbon credits, or just carbon in general. Okay, so it isn't one thing in soils. Soils have to you got to bring them forward in a balance. And so it isn't like you can just concentrate on one thing. And when we do this, when we have this balance occur, and we see some things improve, water quality is a good indicator. And I'm going to give you this example too. in the perennial systems, the organic inorganic ratio, many times I have about 2/3 organic nitrogen and about 1/3 inorganic nitrogen. In my cropland, it's kind of flipped the other way. So much of it is in inorganic form and not organic form, a smaller portion. And the interesting thing about that is when I add cover crops, I start to change that ratio again. When I start planting green, because now you have a green plant for that inorganic nutrient to go into. And if you have a green plant, you're never going to secure 100% of it. And I'm not trying to give that illusion, but you are going to secure an additional significant amount. And so it's well worth looking at when we bring in planting green concepts. They do change inorganic organic nitrogen ratios of what typically kind of a range of what you find there. And so the water quality aspect is such a huge item. And again, that's a week-long conference. And I think we need people going into that line of work, basically, or that type of everything from research to practice on the ground that makes these impacts. Because I think that's definitely part of the human race going forward. It's a big item. And to me, it hinges on a green plant. And if we can bring green plants in during periods of time we don't normally have one, or increase the diversity, that's a game changer. And so, yeah, big impact.
Okay, thanks. This next question is a bit of a shift from Michelle in Oneida County. She'd really love to apply some of these principles to lakeshore restoration projects. Right now, we only use annual rye alongside native plug plantings and don't interseed native perennial seeds. Do you have any thoughts on what they could do better, especially when converting lawn to a native buffer?
Yeah. So a lot of times, some of these are in residential areas. Sometimes they're maybe not. I'm not sure exactly the setting that we're talking about, but we brought a new individual on board recently at the Minokan farm, and the new position is called urban conservationist. And so that's giving us an opportunity to look at some of these things. So one of the things that, I ordered additional species this past year, not just for beetle banks, but to bring in these smaller areas that are more targeted, if you will. The thing that I guess I've usually have seen on these is they're usually too small, and they're usually not wide enough. Or if they have quite a bit of nutrient coming across them, they saturate, if you will. And so the biggest issue I see, and then they rarely have livestock. And so, the livestock are really good at maintaining these buffer areas, etc. But they're not always practical if they're in a livestock, or excuse me, if they're in a residential area. Livestock aren't always compatible in those, and so it might have to be some other type of maintenance, some type of mowing, etc. But anything we can do to widen that area, because it's and then why is it there in the first place? Why is there excess nutrient there? How do we go back to the fields and recycle it there? And the only way you're really going to recycle it there in a cropland setting is if you have a green plant for it to go into at the end of harvest. We always have residual amounts of nitrogen. Many times that's kind of what can drive our pH levels down, this acidification. But if we have a green plant, now we got the opportunity to take that inorganic nutrient and get it into a plant, let it go back through and keep it in that same field. So yeah, that's a tough one. I don't like talking to any of you people in Wisconsin because you just ask such difficult questions. No, that's just a joke. But that's a good question, but that's definitely a reflection of how we live on the land, and that's not always a popular statement, but it's coming from someplace, and we need to cycle it back before it even gets to that location. is the long-term answer. Short-term answer is anything we can do to widen that area to give it more potential or chance, because so many of our buffers, they're just too small.
Right. Well, speaking of tough questions in Wisconsin, the chat box is really filling up. We have a lot of people interested in hearing more from you, and we're a little low on time. Jay, would you be willing to maybe take some of this and answer in writing after the session is over and take a couple days to respond?
I would be more than honored.
Okay, there's really quite a few questions. I think I'll take one more here. I'll give you one more before we pause. Let you go. Let's see.
I was hoping to visit with you folks in person,
Mhm.
because the hallway and the water cooler or whatever is a great place to have some of these conversations.
Yep.
Or evenings afterwards, but maybe that's for a different day. And so appreciate the questions. The questions wouldn't be there if you didn't care. And so I appreciate that.
Yeah, we certainly miss those in-person conversations too.
Yeah, they're hard to replace.
Right. All right, well, let's try to fit in another question or two.
Okay.
So Mitch from SOC, again, he mentioned you having yearling cattle in the spring and getting rid of them in the fall. Has stockers been more profitable, cow and calves for you?
I think the cow calf would be just fine for us financially. They would be really good for us, but no one lives at the farm. And so over the winter, there's less activity there. And since there's not somebody living there, the local board, the Burley Soil District, made the decision that the yearlings might fit better for what we do, and so that's the route we've gone. I don't think it was a financially driven statement. It was more of animal livestock husbandry statement.
Okay.
The cows would do really well, and dry cows, for example, would gain way more than these open heifers because they've already achieved their full weight, and they would do quite a bit better from a gain viewpoint. But the open heifers are would be my next choice because they have there's such an interest in replacement selection, and there's so much to be learned about their genetics, and then all of the soil aspects that go along with it.
Okay. All right, I think we'll squeeze in one more question here. You have a podcast fan. It says, you told the story on the Regenerative Ag podcast about changes observed in the Minokan farm landscape after implementing cover crops. I was specifically fascinated with your anecdote about the changes in water levels observed in ponds on the farm after planting covers. Can you speak to this a bit more?
Yeah, for sure. So we have a large wetland. I would call it normally a type 3, but when we first moved to the farm in 2009, it was way out of its banks, and it would have a tendency to cross the gravel road on occasion. And the interesting thing was when the covers came into play, we started seeing it with the crop diversity and the no-till system as well. But then when the covers came into play, it actually took that. I haven't seen water in that wetland for, I suppose since we started in 2009. The last time we had water in it would have been 10 or 11. And so no one drained that wetland. We don't do that. But now the water no longer runs across the surface and goes to the wetland. Now it goes into the profile. So it's a game changer. And then I've worked on a lot of different ranch operations over the years that once we put the grazing system in, rotational grazing system with some adequate rest recovery time, I've seen the ponds go down. And so the grass production went up dramatically, but the pond level went down. And so there's your difference between the water going strictly across the surface instead going into the profile. But that's the difference with soil aggregation. So with that, Kate, I'd be happy to take one more or not.
So we do have a little bit more conference to get to, and I do want to let our attendees get a break before the next sessions.
Absolutely. I
Grab
agree
some
with-
food, but perhaps we can have a communication via email and
Yeah.
get some of these other questions in your hands, because there are quite a few others. I think this is an important topic.
I'd be happy to try to answer them. And if I don't know the answer, I'm going to say something very creative like, I don't know.
Well, it's good to be honest.
I think so.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing all your time and expertise today, Jay. This is obviously a
Big
very
shout
exciting
out to,
topic.
big shout out to Wisconsin. I appreciate everything all of you do. I want you to know that, and wish you the best going forward.
Thank you so much, Jay. I did put a link for the Minokan Farm website again in the chat box, so attendees can check out all of that information you cited, as well as articles and podcasts and videos. Looks like it's a pretty well-run website with a lot of information there.
We'd be happy to have you come visit sometime too. Come in the summertime. Come in the summer.
Yeah, probably not so nice right now.
Very
All
good.
right. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Jay.
Thank you, Kate.